The princess came to me at 3 in the morning and asked me to stop a clock. I want you to understand something first. In Ellenmark, you don't stop a clock for no reason. When someone dies in a house, you stop the clocks. That's the old way. My grandmother did it. Her mother did it. You stop the hands and you cover the mirrors and you let the house sit quiet for a while so the person leaving has somewhere to leave from. The king was not dead. He was upstairs in the blue room, breathing thin, alive. And his son's wife stood in the corridor in a gray coat with ink on her sleeve, and she asked me to stop the clock outside his door. I said, "Ma'am, he hasn't gone." And she looked at me with those tired eyes and she said, very softly, "I know Jonas." Then she said, "It isn't for him. My name is Jonas Breck. I wound the clocks at Ashcourt Palace for 41 years. My knees are bad now and my hands shake a little in the cold, but I can still tell you the sound of every clock in that building. There were 206 of them. I'm not guessing. I counted them the first week in a little green notebook, and I still have the notebook. Nobody thinks about the clocks. That's the thing. People come to Ashcourt and they look up at the ceilings, at the gold, at the paintings of dead men on horses. They don't think about the fact that somebody has to open every one of those cabinets every week and turn a key and set the hands right. That was me, Wednesdays and Saturdays. 41 years, twice a week, walking the same corridors with a canvas roll of keys over my shoulder. I knew that palace the way you know the inside of your own mouth. I knew which floorboard outside the music room sang when you stepped on the left side of it. I knew that the door to the North Gallery stuck in August and swung free in February. I knew that the big clock in the Hall of Kings ran 40 seconds slow every week no matter what I did, and I loved it for that, the stubborn old thing. And because nobody thinks about the clocks, nobody thought about me. I was furniture, I was a man on a ladder. Which means I heard everything. You have to picture Wesen in October. That's when this happened. Late October, the year King Havard was dying. The city sits on the water. Water, gray stone, gulls screaming over the fish market from 4 in the morning like they've got some grievance nobody ever settled. The wind comes off the sea and up the hill and it goes straight through your coat, through your shirt, through you. Tourists come in June. In October it's just us and the rain and the gulls. Ashcourt Palace sits at the top of that hill, facing the harbor. Gray too. It's not a beautiful building, honestly. Foreigners are always a bit disappointed. It's long and low and heavy, like something built to survive a war rather than impress anybody, which is exactly what it was. Tourists still lined up at the gate, though. Every day, rain or not. Standing there in plastic ponchos, phones out, waiting for the guard change at 11. Waiting to see the little ceremony we do, the boots, the turn, the rifles. 12 minutes of it. Then they'd wander off to buy a fridge magnet with the king's face on it. That autumn the crowds were bigger, not for the guards. They came because the king was dying, and everybody knew it. They stood at the gate and they looked up at the windows. Some of them left flowers against the railings, and the rain got into the flowers, and by the third week, the whole railing smelled sweet and rotten, like a fruit bowl somebody forgot about. Inside, we were getting ready for a coronation. That's the part people forget. When a king dies, the machine doesn't stop and grieve. The machine starts moving. There were tailors in the East Wing. There were men from the ministry measuring the aisle of the cathedral with a wheel on a stick. There was a woman from the household who spent 4 days on the seating chart and cried at her desk on the 5th, and I brought her tea and pretended I hadn't seen. 10 days out, that's where we were. 10 days from putting a crown on Anders. I should tell you about him. Crown Prince Anders, 38 years old that autumn. Tall and slightly ashamed of being tall, the way some tall men are. He had a habit of standing with one knee bent so he'd come down to your level. Sandy hair going gray at the sides. A laugh that was too loud for a palace, which I always liked about him. He wasn't a serious boy. I remember him at 11, riding a bicycle down the long gallery and taking a corner too fast and going straight into a suit of armor that had stood there since 1740. Terrible crash. The helmet rolled about 30 feet. He looked at me, absolutely white, and he said, "Jonas, Jonas, please." I helped him put it back together. Took us an hour. We never told anybody. He was still that boy in some ways. But by that October he had gone gray around the eyes, and he wasn't sleeping, and I'd find him at odd hours in odd rooms. Once, near midnight, I came into the map room to wind the bracket clock, and he was just sitting in the dark on the floor with his back against the wall, in a suit, like a man waiting for a train. He said, "Don't stop, do your clock." So I did my clock. I wound it and I set it and I closed the case. And on the way out he said, "Jonas, did you know my father?" I said, "I've served him 39 years, sir." He said, "That's not what I asked." I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't. Now Solveig. She wasn't born to it. That's the first thing anyone in Ellenmark will tell you about her. And half of them mean it as a compliment and half of them mean it as an insult. And after 20 years they still can't agree. She came from Mordvik. That's up the coast, 4 hours north, a fishing town with a stone sea gate and about 9,000 people in it. Her father was a school teacher. Her mother sorted fish. And Solveig went to university and she became an archivist. That's what she did before she met him. She worked in the basement of the National Archive in Vessen with cotton gloves on, putting paper into boxes, writing labels. 14 years of that. She used to say she'd read more of Ellenmark's history than the family that ruled it, and she'd say it laughing, and nobody laughed back very hard. She met Anders at a reception she wasn't supposed to be at. She was standing in for her supervisor who had food poisoning. She spent the whole evening near a window, holding one glass of wine she never drank, and he walked over and asked her what she did, and she told him, and he asked a follow-up question. She told me once that was the thing. He asked a second question. The wedding nearly didn't happen. There were people in that palace who fought it for 2 years. There were newspapers that ran her mother's photograph next to a picture of a fish crate. Some of the old families never really forgave her, and they were still not forgiving her 20 years later, at dinners, quietly, in the polite way rich people do things. She never once complained about it in my hearing, not once. She was small, dark hair, going silver at the temple on one side only, which she refused to dye. Very still. She had this way of being completely still when she listened to you, so still that people would keep talking just to fill the space and end up saying more than they meant to. Anders called her Saul, nobody else did, Saul like the sun. Their children called her Mama. They were 19 and 16, and away at school that autumn, and the fact that they stayed away tells you something about how bad it was in that house. Here's when I first knew something was wrong, and it wasn't the clock. It was a Wednesday, second week of October. I was winding the long case in the lower library, which is a room nobody uses, and I heard the door. She came in without seeing me. I was behind the reading stacks up on the third step of my ladder, and she came in and went straight to the back where the old estate ledgers are, and she sat down on the floor. Not at a table. On the floor, in a good wool skirt on the floor. And she had a box with her. A green metal box about the size of 2 bricks with a lock on it. She didn't open it. She just sat there with it on her knees, both hands flat on the lid, and she stayed like that for maybe 6 or 7 minutes. Then she said out loud to nobody, "I'm sorry." And she got up and she left. I stayed on that ladder a long time. My legs had gone numb. I told myself it was grief. The king was dying. People do strange things. But she hadn't said "I'm sorry" the way you say it to a dying man. She'd said it the way you say it to somebody you're about to do something to. The king. I should tell you about the king, because you can't understand the choice unless you understand what was breathing upstairs in the blue room. Havard, 84 years old, king for 51 of them. He was not a warm man. I'll be honest with you. He was correct. He learned every servant's name and used it, and he never once in 39 years asked me a question about myself. He wrote thank you notes in his own hand. He stood in the rain at every memorial every year without a coat because his father had done it without a coat. And the whole country loved him for one reason, one story. And you can go into any pub in Vesson tonight, and someone will tell it to you inside 10 minutes. The king who never left. You know the story. When the occupation came, in the war, other royal families ran. They got on boats and planes and they governed from other people's countries and waited it out. Ellenmark's king stayed. Havard's father, King Eric, stayed at Ashcourt Palace through all 4 years. He did not leave the hill. There's a photograph, everybody knows this photograph, it's in every school book, it's on the 10 krona note of Eric standing at the palace gate in a plain black coat, no guards, facing an officer of the occupying army. Just standing there. Not shouting. Standing. He stayed with us, that's what my mother said. The others ran, he stayed with us. And on that story, that single photograph, the House of Ellenmark survived the century. Other monarchies got voted away. Ours didn't, because our king stayed. Havard was Eric's son. He grew up inside that story. He carried it his whole reign like a man carrying a full glass across a crowded room. And that October, he was in the blue room with a nurse on either side, and his hands had gone blue at the fingertips, and he weighed about as much as my coat. Anders sat with him every night, sometimes for hours. I know because I wind the clock in the corridor outside that door, and twice a week I'd go past, and I'd see the light under it, and I'd hear nothing at all. 2 men in a room and no talking. So 3 in the morning. It was a Saturday, technically, though 3 in the morning belongs to nobody. I was there because of the barometer clock in the green drawing room, which had stopped, and I'd promised myself I'd get to it before the ministry people came back on Monday and started rearranging furniture. That's the truth. I was there fixing a clock nobody had noticed had stopped. The palace at night is not quiet. Everybody thinks it is. It ticks. 206 clocks, none of them in agreement, and the sound comes at you from every direction like rain on a roof. And under that, the sea. And under that, the building itself moving, the beams, the pipes. I had my roll of keys and a little torch, and I was coming up the back stairs, and I turned onto the landing of the 2nd floor, and she was standing there. Princess Solveig, gray coat. Not a nightdress, not a robe, a coat buttoned like she'd been outside or like she was about to go. I nearly dropped the torch. Ma'am, I'm sorry, I didn't. It's all right, Jonas. She'd been crying. Not right then. Earlier. You could see it around the eyes, and she made no attempt at all to hide it, which unsettled me more than crying would have. And there was ink on her right sleeve. A long smear of it near the cuff, blue-black, dried. Archive ink. The old kind from the old ledgers that comes off on your hands when the paper is very old and has been kept somewhere damp. She saw me see it. She turned the cuff over. Then she said, I need you to do something for me. Of course, ma'am. The clock in the corridor, outside the blue room. I knew it. The Bergstrom bracket clock, walnut case, made in Vesson in 1809. A beautiful, ugly thing with a slow tick you could set your breathing to. Yes, ma'am. I want you to stop it. And I stood there on the landing with my keys and my torch, and I felt the whole night go strange around me. I said it as gently as I could. Ma'am, he hasn't gone. I know, Jonas. Then, it isn't for him. She said it very simply, not dramatic. She said it the way you'd tell someone the shop is closed. I said, ma'am, forgive me, I don't understand. And she was quiet for a moment. The clocks ticked all around us, 206 of them out of step. Then she said, someone in this house died a very long time ago, and nobody stopped anything for them. She said 12 people actually. I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. "Please," she said, "stop it at 11 minutes past 4. And then she went down the stairs and out towards the lower library, and I heard the door. I did it. God help me. I climbed the ladder and I opened that walnut case, and I put my finger against the pendulum, and I held it until it stopped swinging, and the tick went out of that corridor like a light going off. Then I moved the hands to 11 minutes past 4. You have never heard silence until you have heard one clock stop in a corridor where a man is dying. I stood there on that ladder for a long time. 12 people, she'd said, in this house. I went home at dawn and I did not sleep. I sat in my kitchen with my coat still on, and I watched the light come up gray over the roofs, and I thought about 12 people, and my hands were shaking, and I told myself it was the cold. It wasn't the cold. I'll tell you now because you'll find out anyway. It wasn't the cold, because some part of me, some old buried part, some part that had been sitting in the dark for 60 years, recognized the number. My father used to say something. He said it maybe 4 times in his whole life, always drunk, always late, always looking at the wall. He'd say there were 13 names on that list, and the king's pen crossed one of them out. And when I asked him what list, he'd stand up and go to bed. He died when I was 22. He never told me. And I went and got a job at that palace, and I stayed 41 years, and I never once, not once, asked myself why. Nobody said anything about the clock. That's what I couldn't get over. 2 days went by. The nurses went in and out of that door, and the household people went past with their clipboards, and the chamberlain himself walked under it twice, and not one human being noticed that the clock outside the king's deathbed had stopped at 11 minutes past 4. The tailors came. The regalia came out of the vault in a case with 2 men holding it. The bishop came to talk about the order of service and stayed for lunch and laughed twice. 10 days, 9 days. And Solveig kept going to the lower library. I saw her 3 more times. She always had the green box. She never opened it while anyone could see. And on the Tuesday she was in there with the door shut for 2.5 hours, and when she came out her face was so white I actually stepped towards her, and she put a hand up. "Don't," she said. "Please, Jonas, if you're kind to me right now I'll fall over." It was the Wednesday she asked me about my father. I was up the ladder in the Hall of Kings, doing the big one, the stubborn one, the 40-second slow one. And she came in and stood at the bottom of the ladder and looked up. "Jonas, was your father from Vessen?" I said, "Mordvik, ma'am, same as you." And something happened in her face. Something closed and something else opened. She said, "I know." Then she said, "What was his name?" "Anton Breck." She nodded slowly. She nodded for too long. And she said, "Come down, please. I don't want to talk to a man on a ladder." I came down. My knees were bad even then. She stood there in that great hall with all those dead men on their horses looking down at us, and she said, "Do you love this family, Jonas?" Nobody had ever asked me that. I thought about it. I actually took a moment because she was the sort of person you didn't lie to. I thought about Havard writing thank you notes. I thought about Anders at 11, white-faced, holding a helmet. I said, "I love the boy, ma'am." She smiled. It was the saddest thing I have ever seen on a person's face. She said, "Good, then remember that. In a few days you may need to." And she walked out of the Hall of Kings, and I stood there, 63 years old, with a key in my hand and no idea what to do with it. Friday night, 6 days before the coronation. I was in the corridor between the map room and the prince's study, which is where the little French clock hangs, the one with the enamel face. It needed a new suspension spring. I'd been putting it off. I had my ladder up and my back to the study door, and the door was not quite closed. I want to be clear about this. I did not stay to listen. I stayed because I was 13 feet up a ladder with a clock movement in both hands, and by the time I understood what was happening, I could not have come down without them hearing me. That's the truth, and it's the only defense I have. Anders was in there. I heard him drop into a chair, that big exhausted sound a person makes at the end of a day like that. And then the door opened again and closed, and I heard her. Anders. Saul, I can't, not tonight. Tomorrow I have the... Anders. Something in it stopped him. There was a sound. A small, definite sound, and I have thought about it for 30 years, and I know exactly what it was. It was the sound of something being set down on a wooden table, something with weight, metal. The green box. Then a second sound, softer paper. And then Solveig said, and she said it quietly, so quietly I had to hold my breath to hear, and I could hear the sea through the window behind her. Before they put that crown on your head, you have to know what it's made of. Nothing, not a word from him. 4 years, she said. I've had it 4 years. I nearly burned it twice. I nearly told you 100 times, and every time I looked at you I thought, no, not yet, he's happy tonight. So, your grandfather did not stay because he was brave. The clock in my hands, I could feel my own pulse through the brass. He stayed, she said, because he paid. And then God, her voice cracked. It broke right in half. He paid with 12 men from my town, and one of them, Anders, one of them was my grandfather. Silence, long, terrible. Then Anders said, very low, what do you want from me? And Solveig said, in 6 days you'll stand in that cathedral and you'll swear an oath in front of a country that loves a story that isn't true. So you have a choice, and I won't make it for you. Burn this and be crowned, and I'll stand beside you and smile, and I will never mention it again as long as I live. Lord. Or tell them all of it, and watch this family end. I heard him stand up, I heard him breathe. And she said the thing that I have never forgotten, the thing I hear in my sleep, in that quiet, stubborn voice from a fishing town 4 hours up the coast. I'm not asking you to be a king, Anders. Kings are easy. I'm asking you to be the man I thought I married. And I need to know which one you are before they put that crown on you, because after that, it's too late for both of us. Then nothing. And in the whole of Ashcourt Palace, in all those long gray corridors, 205 clocks went on ticking. The 206th stood outside a dying king's door, its hands frozen at 11 minutes past 4, marking a death that had happened 60 years before, that nobody in that house had ever been allowed to grieve. I don't remember coming down the ladder. I remember I was standing at the bottom of it with the clock movement still in my hands, the little French one, brass and steel, and it had gone warm from being held. And I remember thinking, quite clearly, quite stupidly, the suspension spring. I never fitted the suspension spring. The mind does that. It grabs the smallest thing in the room and holds on. I put the movement in my coat pocket. I folded the ladder. I carried it down the back stairs and out through the yard door, past the bins, past the 2 lads from the kitchen having a smoke in the rain, and one of them said, "All right, Jonas," and I said something back, and I have no idea what. The rain was coming sideways off the harbor. I walked down the hill without my hat. 12 men from my town. That's what she'd said, 12 men from my town. Except Mordvik was my town too. I lived then in a flat above a shoe repair shop on Ilder Street, 3 rooms, low ceilings, and I'd lived there 29 years and my wife had died in the back bedroom of it, and I'd never once thought about moving. Her name was Marit. She'd been gone 11 years by that October. Every so often I still spoke to her, not out loud, just in my head, the way you do. That night I went into the spare room. There was a trunk in there, my father's. It had come to me when he died, and I had opened it exactly once in 1963, when I was 22 and angry, and I'd closed it again inside a minute because it smelled of him and I wasn't ready. 41 years later, I dragged it out from under the window, and I sat on the floor with my back against the bed, and I opened it properly. Here is what was in Anton Breck's trunk. A pipe he never smoked in front of my mother, 3 shirts, a tin of buttons, a photograph of a fishing boat, 6 men on it, all of them squinting, a prayer book with the spine gone, a pair of boots cracked across the toe, and inside one boot, rolled up, a Mordvik school certificate with his name on it in copperplate. And at the bottom, under everything, folded in newspaper, a coil of rope. Just a piece of rope, 2 feet of it, old tarred, the kind they use on the seagate at Mordvik to lash the boats when the storm comes up. I sat there with it in my hands, and I couldn't have told you why a man keeps a piece of rope for 50 years. But I sat there for a long time. And I thought about how, at Christmas, when he'd had a drink, my father would sometimes stand at the window with his back to the room and not turn around when you spoke to him. And I thought about the 4 times in his life he said it. 13 names on that list, and the king's pen crossed one of them out. You need to know about Mordvik. It's 4 hours up the coast on a bad road. 9,000 people, less now. Everything in it faces the water because the water is the only reason it exists. The seagate is what people come for if anybody comes at all. It's a wall of gray stone across the harbor mouth, built in 1600-something, with a gap in it for the boats and 2 towers either side. When the north storms come, the sea hits that wall and goes up 30 feet and comes down on the harbor like a dropped roof. As a boy, I'd stand and watch it, and my mother would scream at me from the door. During the war, the whole country's cargo moved through Mordvik. It had to. It was the only harbor on that coast the ice didn't close. That's why it happened there. It's always about something as boring as that. It's never about hate or glory or any of it. It's about which harbor doesn't freeze. In the second winter of the occupation, somebody put a charge on the railway bridge at Calv, 11 kilometers inland, and dropped it into the river. A train went in with it. 41 soldiers of the occupying army died in the water, and it took them 9 days to get all the bodies out. Nobody ever found who did it. That is the last true thing anybody agrees on about that winter. Everything after it in the school books is 1 paragraph long. There followed a period of severe reprisals in the Mordvik region. 1 paragraph. I read it as a boy. I read it out loud in a classroom in a town where it happened, to a teacher who had lived through it, and neither of us said anything about it at all. I went back to the palace on the Monday, because what else was I going to do? 4 days to the coronation. The place had gone mad. There were flowers arriving by the van load for the cathedral. There was a man from the ministry with a clipboard standing in the Hall of Kings shouting at another man about chairs. Somebody had brought in a photographer, and he was setting lights up in the long gallery, right where the armor stands, and I wanted to tell him about the boy on the bicycle, and I did not. I went and looked at the blue room corridor. The clock was still stopped, 11 minutes past 4. Nobody had touched it, nobody had noticed. The nurses went in and out. I stood there like a man on a station platform. And then a door opened behind me, and it was Anders. He came out of his father's room and shut it very softly and stood there with his hand still on the handle. He was in a gray suit with no tie. He looked at me, and it took him about 2 seconds to find my name, which had never once happened before in 38 years. Jonas. Sir. He looked at the clock. He looked at it for a good while. He said, "Did you stop that?" And there it was, the moment. I could have lied. It would have been the easiest thing in the world. "Yes, sir." "Why?" "The princess asked me to." He nodded, slowly, the same slow nod she'd done in the Hall of Kings. And I understood for the first time that people who live together for 20 years start to move the same way. He said, "Of course she did." Then he said, "Do you know what time it stopped at?" 11 minutes past 4, sir. She asked for that specifically. Something went across his face. It was not surprise, it was worse. It was a man having a thing confirmed. He said, right, and he said it the way you'd say it if somebody told you a test result. He walked away down the corridor. Halfway down, he stopped and stood with his back to me, exactly the way my father used to stand at that window at Christmas, and my whole scalp went cold. Then he went on. She came to me that evening. I was in the boot room, which is where I keep my bench, a long, thin room off the yard with a window at the far end, and a smell of leather and oil that I would know in my grave. I had the little French clock in bits on a cloth. She knocked. She actually knocked on the doorframe of a boot room in her own house. "May I come in?" I stood up so fast I knocked the tweezers off the bench. "Ma'am." "Sit down, Jonas, please. Sit down and keep doing that. I can't talk to somebody standing to attention." So I sat, and I picked up the spring, and my hands were shaking so badly I put it down again. She pulled over the stool. She sat on it. Princess of Ellenmark on a stool in a boot room with her coat over her arm. She said, "Your father was Anton Breck of Mordvik, born 1926. He worked on the Sildra out of the East Quay. He was 17 years old in the winter of the bridge." I said nothing. There was nothing to say. She wasn't asking. "He died in 1963, she said. "Liver. He is buried in the churchyard at Mordvik, second row from the wall, and there is no dedication on the stone, just the name and the dates." I said, "You've been to the grave?" "Yes." "Why?" And she said, "Because I've known who you were for 4 years, and I've been trying to work out whether telling you would be a kindness or a cruelty, and I've decided that isn't mine to decide." She put the green box on my bench, between the pieces of the clock. She said, "You're the last one. There's nobody else left, so you get to know." I want to tell you what she found and how, because she told me, sitting on that stool, and she told it plainly, and it took about half an hour, and I will never in my life hear anything told better. 4 years before, the National Archive had begun moving its lower stores. Damp. The building sits below the water line, and it always has. There were rooms down there nobody had opened since the 50s. Solveig was not supposed to be involved. She was a princess by then. But she had spent 14 years in that basement, and she knew the collections better than anyone alive, and she asked, and they could hardly say no to her, and so on Tuesday afternoons, Tuesdays quietly, no photographers. She went down into the lower stores in an old cardigan and helped sort what came out of the wet. She said it was the happiest she'd been in years. I believe it. In the 3rd month, they opened a room off the South Corridor that turned out to be full of the Wartime Harbor Board. Requisition orders, fuel dockets, ration schedules, 20,000 pages of the most boring paper ever produced by human beings, and it was in that room, in a bundle tied with tape, that she found a folder that did not belong to the Harbor Board at all. It was palace stationery. Somebody, in a panic at the end of the war, had put palace papers into a Harbor Board bundle. That's all. That's the whole accident. One frightened clerk with an armful of paper and a fire to build somewhere else, and he shoved it in the nearest box, and he never came back for it. She said she knew before she opened it. She said the paper was too good. Inside were 4 documents. The first was a letter in German from the office of the regional commander, dated 11 days after the bridge. It said that the reprisal would proceed. It named a figure. It said that the figure was, and she used this word because the document used this word, negotiable. The second was a letter from the palace. A draft, not sent, with crossings out. Somebody had struggled with it. She said you could see the man's hand getting worse as he went. It proposed terms. It proposed that the palace remain occupied by the king, that the flag continue to fly, that the guard change continue at the gate each morning at 11 o'clock. It said, and she quoted this to me from memory, in a boot room, without one tremor in her voice, that the continued presence of His Majesty upon the hill is of considerable value to the good order of the population. Good order of the population. And in exchange for that good order, the palace would assist in the identification of persons of interest in the Mordvik district. The third document was a note, 3 lines unsigned. It said that the figure of 100 was not survivable for the town, and asked whether a smaller number, drawn from the harbor men, might be accepted as sufficient. Somebody had written in the margin in pencil in another hand, 13. And the fourth document was the list. I asked her to describe it to me. I don't know why. I couldn't have opened that box myself. I know that now. My hands would not have done it. She said it was one sheet, foolscap typed. 13 names, numbered 1 to 13. Beside each name the boat and the key and the age. She said the ages were the thing that undid her. She said she was sitting on the floor of the lower store with the damp coming through her skirt, and she got to the ages, and she had to put the paper face down on the concrete. 19, 22, 40, 31, 55. Number 9 on that list was Havard Nyholm, aged 44, of the Sildra, East Key. Solveig's grandfather, her mother's father, a man she had never met, whose photograph hung in her mother's kitchen in Mordvik above the bread bin, whose name she had been told all her life was taken in the war, the way you'd say a man was taken by the sea. No details. Nobody asked. Nobody in that town ever asked. She sat on the concrete, and she looked at his name. And she said the second thing she noticed, the thing that took her a moment longer, was that the list had been signed at the bottom in a hand she had seen 10,000 times in her professional life, on charters and warrants and the flyleaf of every book in the palace library. Eric, the king who stayed. The signature was steady. And number 13 on that list, the last name, was struck through with a single line of ink, not scribbled, not blotted, one clean line drawn with a ruler, the way a man draws a line when he has thought about it. Anton Breck, Sildra, East Key, age 17. The boot room was very quiet. Somewhere out in the yard, a gull was going on about something. I said, "Say the number again." She said 17. I said, "No, the other number." She understood. She's the fastest person I ever met. She said, "The 12 were taken from the sea gate at 4 in the morning on the 11th of February. It is recorded in the church register at Mordvik in a marginal hand. The time given is 11 minutes past 4. And I put both my hands flat on the bench, because the room had begun to move. 11 minutes past 4, that I had set with my own fingers 4 days ago at the door of that man's son. She said quite gently, "Jonas, the boy was let go at the gate. He walked home. He was 17 and he walked back into a town that had lost 12 men, and he was the only one who came back." "Why?" I said. "Why did he cross him out?" And she said the truest thing anybody has ever said to me. She said because he wanted to be able to live with it. I sat in that boot room after she left, and I did not move for 2 hours. I thought about the rope. 2 feet of tarred rope from the sea gate, kept in a trunk for 50 years, under 3 shirts and a tin of buttons. I thought about a boy of 17, walking 4 kilometers uphill in the dark in February, alive. I thought about how he never once took me to the sea gate. Not once, in a town 9,000 people big, where the sea gate is the only thing there is. He'd walk the long way round the harbor. My mother thought he had a bad knee. And I thought about a letter. I was 23. I had no trade. My father had been in the ground a year, and I was drinking his drink, and a letter came to my mother's house in Mordvik on good paper. It said there was a position at Ashcourt Palace, assistant to the clockmaker. It said my name. I never applied for that job. I have said for 41 years in pubs at weddings to my wife, I don't know how it happened, I got lucky. A letter just came. Havard had been king for 11 years by then. He was 33 years old. His father was 2 years dead, and somewhere in that palace, a young king went through his father's papers and found something, and did the only thing that a man like that knows how to do. He wrote a letter in his own hand. He did not confess. He did not apologize. He never in 39 years asked me one question about myself. He just quietly made sure that Anton Breck's son had a job for life in his own house, where he could see him twice a week, on Wednesdays and Saturdays. 41 years of walking those corridors with a canvas roll of keys. 41 years of being furniture. I had thought it was luck. I had thought it was a kindness. It was a payment, and I took it and I raised a family on it, and I buried my wife on it, and I never knew. 3 days to the coronation. I went up to the palace on the Wednesday morning as I had gone up on 10,000 Wednesday mornings. The gulls, the hill, the rotting flowers on the railing, and the tourists under their plastic phones up, waiting for 11 o'clock. Waiting for the guard change. The continued presence of His Majesty upon the hill is of considerable value to the good order of the population. I stood at the gate that morning with my keys, and I watched those boys march out in turn, and I watched the crowd go quiet and lift their phones, and I watched a girl of about 6 sitting on her father's shoulders, absolutely rapt, and I thought. They kept the guard change. Through 4 years, every morning at 11, with the flag up and the king on the hill and everything correct and the boots coming down together on the stone. Because it was of considerable value. I got through the gate and I got as far as the yard, and then I had to stop and hold the wall, and one of the kitchen lads asked if I was all right, and I said it was my knees. That afternoon at 3:10, a nurse came out of the blue room and walked, not ran, walked very quickly along the corridor. Havard died at 3:20. They rang the great bell at St. Ansgar's 40 minutes later, and the sound came up the hill through the rain, and the whole city stopped, and out at the gate people started to cry, people who had never met him, and someone began to sing the old anthem, and others took it up badly, out of tune, in the wet. Inside, they went round the palace stopping the clocks. 2 boys from the household with a list in a hurry. They didn't know how. They were pulling on the hands. I followed them for an hour and did it properly behind them, one after another, opening the case, stilling the pendulum with a finger, setting the hands to 20 to 4. 205 clocks. I came to the Bergstrom bracket clock outside the blue room last. It was already stopped. Its hands stood at 11 minutes past 4, and I looked at it for a long time, and I left it exactly as it was. The palace went completely silent. All that ticking gone. I have never heard anything like it before or since. It was like the building had stopped breathing. And in that silence I heard from behind the door of his father's room one man crying, not loudly, the way men of that family cry. He was in there 50 minutes. When he came out, his eyes were red and his face was perfectly still, and Solveig was standing in the corridor waiting for him, and she had not gone in because she knew. He looked at her. Nobody spoke. And then Anders lifted his hand and put it flat on the cold walnut case of that stopped clock, the way you'd put your hand on a coffin, and he stood there with his palm on it and his eyes shut. He said 3 days. She said yes. He said, Saul, tell me what to do. And she said no.